Welcome again to the Community Based Adaptation Conference in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I have with me
Charles Ehrhart with CARE International.
Okay, we've been hearing a lot, well, the whole title is Community Based Adaptation, but we haven't really addressed in any of the interviews what community means and whether people actually agree with what community is in this context.
Right, okay. There are two different elements here. One is community. What do we mean by community? And the other is the based element. What does it mean, community-based adaptation? And how might that differ from community adaptation or other forms of climate change adaptation more broadly? First, with regards to the question of community, defining community. That's tricky because people have been defining and redefining communities, and there's been a long-standing debate and evolving discourse around what do we mean by community, in part because the nature of community and how people experience community has been changing so much in our societies due to rural to urban migration, things like this. So how we conceive of, how we understand a community is constantly evolving, probably not because we don't understand it, but because our experience of community is constantly shifting. However, the important point to understand here, I think, the core point to understand and take away, is recognition that communities are not homogeneous blobs, right? That you cannot speak about the community priorities or the community concerns or the community situation, or for that matter, you can't really speak adequately about community vulnerability because you have tremendous variability within communities and even within households, right? And that's legitimate. So one of the key things to understand about all of this is when we're talking about communities, it means working with people in communities to understand and appreciate the diversity of concerns, perspectives, and insights into prospective solutions. Now, the other element, based, well, this is really important, and in the last several years, speaking with a number of people that are coming into this field of work, I found that term has led to a lot of misunderstanding and confusion and frustration. And where that comes from, it seems, is people listening to this idea or this terminology of community-based adaptation and believing that means community level. Right? Okay. It doesn't. That terminology has a history, and what it's really coming out of most directly is an idea of community-based development. And community-based development was not about development that is just rooted down at the community level, because we appreciate how complex and rich the development challenge is, and you cannot understand what is causing, much less address what is driving poverty, if you're only working at that local level. Right? There are so many drivers, whether we're talking about governance, whether we're talking about complex impacts of economic markets, et cetera, that extend beyond the community. So community-based development was never about just working there. It meant community-driven development or community-led development. And the same is true here. When we talk about community-based adaptation, what we mean is that this needs to be community-driven and community-led adaptation. In other words, adaptation from the bottom up, right? Which is in contrast to a much more top-down model of climate change adaptation. Now,
can I just interrupt you 1 second? One of the things I've found in development, old-time development as it were, is that when people talk about bottom-up development, then they go to villages, to take a silly example, and they're still kind of telling people what to do. They're educated, they think they know best, and often it doesn't seem to be particularly bottom-up, except that people are going somewhere with this idea in their heads. Do you think that is an old-fashioned naive feeling, or have the practitioners, I'm counting you as one of them, moved on from that?
There's progress. But you see, part of the reason that we struggle with this, and as a practitioner, we constantly are pulling our hair out over a tension of, we understand what community-led development is. To a large extent, we understand much of how to do it. However, we're still operating within paradigms donor-driven agendas, et cetera, that make it very difficult for us to do that. Now, we're constantly finding creative ways to get out of the box that these top-down structures force us into. Top-down funding and finance structures force us away from a more bottom-up approach. However, we're constantly kind of trying to push the envelope to move things back. But it is getting better, and one of the reasons for this links to the decentralization process, right? And just as you have decentralized development planning, decentralized disaster risk management investments as well, you also are increasingly having decentralized adaptation planning. And that's where the hope is. To the extent that it is decentralized, that the resources are decentralized and allocated for more locally defined priorities, that's where we have that space. And so now what's happening, very interesting, and this is part of why I'm quite optimistic about the progress we're making here, is that what a lot of the CBA projects are doing is they are empowering communities to engage in district level funding and financial allocation processes. So communities defining what are their adaptation priorities, for instance, and then engaging in these higher level administrative processes, including budget allocation processes, to say, here's where we know, not where we think, where we know, based on the fact that it's our lives, here's where we know the investment needs to be made to have the greatest bang for the buck, right? And now, some of those systems are being set up to allow for that kind of discourse and locally driven allocations. It's not always that way. A lot of the donor investments really preclude that, but even there is growing space that collectively donors and practitioner organizations like my own and many other NGOs, we're coming together to try to figure out, given the model in which we operate, how do we push it so that the agenda can be more locally driven.
We're going to be cut out here, aren't we? We have to stop? Yeah. One more minute. I was just going to say, and governments, you've mentioned donors and practitioners. Do you think governments get it, or are they still, or many of them still seem to have a sort of top-down approach?
It's too variable to generalize. I think, let me put it this way, far more governments get it now, and what's more important, see, it's not, you have to get it, yes, but you can get it, but still not have an institutional structure that's going to allow you to implement that vision of a more locally driven agenda, right? And what's happening now is that we are changing a lot of the institutions writ large, not just organizational structures, but the policies, et cetera, governing them. A lot of those are filling in the gaps to allow this more locally driven, community-driven agenda to express itself. So it is moving in the right direction.
So a little bit positive.
Quite positive. The problem, though, in terms of some of the space for doing the right thing, yes, that is positive. But of course, what is disconcerting is that the system only works if it's got financial fluidity in it, right? You've got to have some resources in there to, when the community identifies what needs to happen, for them to be able to act on that. And that's the worrisome part, is that the amount of resources that are required to meet these locally driven adaptation agendas simply isn't there. Is it going to be there? It's certainly, there's grounds for skepticism or worry that what we need to be there is not going to be there, and certainly is not going to be there in time. You have to remember that there's a substantial procrastination penalty, right? And if you get ahead of the curve, if the money, the resources are there ahead of time, then we know based on experience that saves a lot of resources in the long term. So we can't just say, well, eventually the money for adaptation will be there. It needs to be there now so that we can do it in a financially realistic way. Because if we end up at the top end of the spectrum or projections for what might be needed, that is extremely unlikely to be there. So we need to tackle this proactively. We need to get ahead of the cost curve, and that means getting resources for adaptation to the communities now.
I think I can see over my shoulder there the next panel is going to sit down. Have we got 1 second? I was going to say, is there any hope that the resources will be additional rather than taken from some other aspect of development?
There's always hope, especially given the alternative. However, we are certainly seeing a pattern at present in which a lot of the resources being allocated to quote-unquote adaptation are just being shifted from pre-existing development agendas. It's a shell game in many cases, not all, but in many it is.
Okay, we've got to stop there. Thanks very, very much. Sorry to squeeze you at the end, but if you want more, go to the CARE website and see what they're doing. Thank you very much.